Lord Baelish, perhaps I was wrong to distrust you.
Distrusting me was the wisest thing you've done since you climbed off your horse.
Lord Petyr the Littlefinger Baelish, the protector of the Vale and the lord of the paramount of the Trident. Petyr Baelish is a fascinating character from Game of Thrones and the A Song of Ice and Fire books especially. On the one hand, people tend to see him as an idealised sort of Machiavellian character, for which you could type the phrase Littlefinger analysis into YouTube and find an abundance of videos titled things like how to get things your way, Littlefinger's power play, how to think like Littlefinger, how to get what you want without using force. And then on the other hand, people ridicule him. He's dismissed as a budget Varys because he's not quite as scheming as Varys is, which is debatable to be fair. Ridiculed because he's called Littlefinger, because he desires Catelyn, and then there are the other people who read about Petyr and he makes their skin crawl. I think all of those audience reactions do tell us something important about the man, but none of them quite get at the complete picture as I see it. So I reread every chapter from the books that Petyr Baelish appears or is mentioned in. I'm a psychodynamic counsellor and psychotherapist, and we're going to try and understand Petyr, his psychology, his behaviour, who the hell is he? And you're getting 2 points in this introduction section. The first is the disclaimer that psychoanalyzing a fictional character is a ridiculous thing to be doing. You cannot accurately analyse someone you can't even talk to, someone who isn't even real. It's absurd. It's not what therapists do. You know, I always worry these kind of videos do give the impression that going to therapy is like sitting down and someone just magically psychoanalyzes everything about you. No, that would be awful. It doesn't work like that. But precisely because this isn't a real person, it is safe for us to try and think about who they are and learn something from the admittedly flawed attempt. There is still a massive benefit to these kind of videos. And secondly, before we begin, the quick summary of Petyr Baelish. He is a very scheming, politically shrewd man who has no great lineage and no skill as a fighter or commander or even allies, for which he relies solely on his wits and his manipulation to try and advance his position in the world. He has a reputation for being brilliant with finances and investments, which earned him the role of Master of Coin in the King's Council. He is devious, he is cunning, and he keeps all of his motives very unclear, for which, again, that makes this video a hard one to make because there's a limit to what we do know about Petyr. And finally, it's important to point out that he's a bit different in the books to the show. Not massively on any of the facts, but Aidan Gillen portrays him as overtly devious and sinister. The snake-like edge to which he delivers every line as though it were a villain's monologue. I understand completely why he's made more overtly sinister in the show. I think it does suit that. But we need to remember book Petyr Baelish is less overt.
Sometimes I've heard even brothers and sisters develop certain affections. And when those affections become common knowledge, well, that is an awkward situation.
He takes care to try and present himself as friendly and harmless, kind of indifferent to most things. Like, I found 2 phrases you see a lot in the books around Petyr's dialogue is the phrase Littlefinger yawned or Littlefinger gave a shrug. Sure, he's up to stuff, but he presents the idea that he's not up to anything that's a threat to anyone. He's not highly driven and ambitious, he's just an overly quippy man who takes nothing seriously, doesn't hold grudges or aspire above his station. He's just a cheery, slightly annoying man who is happy to make money and do something useful. Of course, that isn't true, but the way he presents himself is much more like this than revealing the devious undercurrent. And I think it's important we go into this analysis aware of that. So, as ever, add your thoughts in the comments. There are inevitably always things I miss or forgot to mention or only explain one side of. But let's get going. Let's watch a train move across water and then discuss his childhood. Compared to the videos I've made on people like Sansa and Ned and Catelyn, there's a limited amount of art out there for Littlefinger. So instead of just repeatedly showing the same few art images throughout this video, you're going to have Dave's walks as a background. He lets me use his videos for the background a lot of the time. I link it in the description. It's great. Check out his channel if you're interested. But Littlefinger's childhood. Petyr Baelish's life began at a place on the coast called the Fingers. Tyrion describes it as such. Lord Petyr's father had been the smallest of small lords, his grandfather a landless hedge knight. By birth he held no more than a few stony acres on the windswept shore of the Fingers. Effectively he grew up as minor a lord as possible in a society that very much judges people for their nobility and their status, and in the third book we even get to see his ancestral home in a chapter where Petyr and Sansa sail to the Fingers while they wait for Lysa Arryn to visit them before going on to the Eyrie. And it's a really weird chapter. I remember getting to it thinking, okay, this is going to be a chance to really explore who Petyr is. He's been kept quite distant a lot of the books. Now we'll see some of his childhood, pull up some old memories and some vulnerabilities, and it'll be a window into Petyr's mind. Nope. We learned so very little here. The fact a whole chapter at his ancestral home where he even gives Sansa a personal tour, and yet we learn next to nothing. That in itself does tell us something. There are people at the Fingers who Petyr knows, some of them who were there when he was a child, and yet there's such an interesting surface level amiability that he has with them. I'm going to read quite a long extract to try and demonstrate. He gave the old woman a kiss on the cheek and grinned at the younger one. "Who fathered this one, Keller?" The fat woman laughed. "I can't rightly say, my lord. I'm not one for telling them, no. And all the local lads are grateful, I am quite sure." "It is good to have you home, my lord," said the old man. He looked to be at least 80, but he wore a studded brigantine and a longsword at his side. "How long will you be in residence?" "As short a time as possible, Brian, have no fear. Is the place habitable just now, would you say?" "If we knew you were coming, we'd have laid down fresh rushes, my lord," said the crone. "There's a dung fire burning." "Nothing says home like the smell of burning dung." Petyr turns to Sansa. "Griselle was my wet nurse, but she keeps my castle now. Umfred's my steward, and Brian, didn't I name you captain of the guard last time I was here?" "You did, my lord, and you said you'd be getting some more men too, but you never did. Me and the dogs stand all the watches. And very well, I'm sure. No one has made off with any of my rocks or sheep pellets, I see that plainly." Petyr gestured toward the fat woman. "Keller keeps my vast herds. How many sheep do I have at present, Keller?" It all seems friendly enough and jokey enough, but there is a lack of real warmth here. The kiss is a courtesy kiss. He makes joke of Keller saying the obvious surface level thing he might poke fun at, with the sense he makes a similar quip every time he comes here. He asks no one how they are, not even after this 80-year-old man's health. No one asks how he is. All of the questions are pragmatic business ones. It's not cold or full of tension, but here are the people who should know Petyr best, and he behaves with just the same distant, surface-level friendliness with which he does everyone else, including his enemies. And I find that so interesting. And then in all of the tour, we hear nothing of his family or any old memories beyond these two pretty inconsequential points. One is when Sansa is looking at the old Baelish house sigil. "Rather too fierce for an amiable fellow like me," said Petyr. "I much prefer my mockingbird." And this one when they come to an old hermit's cave. "He's dead now, but when I was a boy, my father took me to see him. The man had not washed in 40 years, so you can imagine how he smelled, but supposedly he had the gift of prophecy. He groped me a bit, and said that I would be a great man, and for that my father gave him a skin of wine." Petyr snorted. "I would have told him the same thing for half a cup." At best, we could dig into that anecdote to say he's mocking his father's superstitious beliefs, but if so, it's not affectionate mockery. This is all he says of his father. And of his mother, we know only the cold fact that she was called Elaine. That's it. So what does any of this tell us? Yes, Petyr is not a warm person. I'm not so quick to brand him a psychopath the way it seems many people are. However, there is a definite absence of warmth. That much is true. Probably an absence from his parents as well, judging by the lack of anecdotes, but that's also speculation. I think it would make sense also for a man like Petyr to not want to share much with Sansa here, but it could make sense for Petyr to have been denied some of the affection that is so important to a child in those earliest years of life. However, we don't know. It's certainly worth me raising as a question, but generally the best we can say is the Fingers probably wasn't a happy place for him, and somewhere he was clearly keen to leave. What is more clear though is that Petyr also feels an obvious insecurity about his home. In all of this chapter, Petyr is unmistakably embarrassed about his very modest beginnings. This isn't him going, yes, I began small and I know it looks a bit of a mess, I'm sorry it's not what you're used to, Sansa, but this is where I'm from. No, this is Petyr in practically every sentence with a barrage of quips, poking fun at how lowly and terrible the Fingers is. Like, there's so many quips. The Fingers are a lovely place, if you happen to be a stone. Lord of Sheepshit and master of the Drear Fort. It lacks a certain something. Come, let's see if my hold is as dreary as I recall. This is all a defence of, look, I know it's bad, Sansa, I know it's terrible here, I agree, I'll criticise it to the absolute max. I will get in all sorts of jokes as early as possible so then you don't need to say anything. Don't judge me for it because I don't like it either. Okay, so what does that tell us? Well, it combines with the fact that when Petyr was 8 years old, he was sent to live at the great and mighty castle of Riverrun with the children of the great House Tully, when Petyr's father was lucky enough to make friends with Hoster Tully during the War of the Ninepenny Kings. Petyr getting to be raised as a ward in the greatest house of the Riverlands, where he would hopefully make friends with future great lords and ladies like Edmure, Lysa and Catelyn. I think how Petyr is back at his home possibly suggests something of the way he was treated when he was a child at Riverrun. Petyr has come to expect japes and criticisms at the expense of his lower nobility. It tells us that, and it also tells us this is likely the defence Petyr started to develop. Get in self-deprecating humour first before anyone else could bully or mock him. It would be as good a defence at Riverrun as he could hope for. You know, he can't make them stop teasing him because they're children of Lord Hoster Tully. He's just some lesser child who is being allowed to stay there as a favour. He's not a big or strong person, so he can't fight anyone. He has no one else at Riverrun to outnumber them. He is inescapably stuck in the role of someone to tease. And, you know, I say bully. We don't know how serious or extreme the teasing was here. Maybe it was just light-hearted banter, perhaps meant with affection, but especially when you're a child, that's not always how it feels. Banter, as people call it, might not always be intended as serious, but it can still feel really cruel and painful. The best thing Petyr can do against it is make jokes himself. Act like he doesn't take it too seriously, like he agrees. Mock himself, maybe develop his yawning and shrugging attitude, because it's hard to poke fun at a person's weakness if they don't seem to care about it, you know? Yeah, I know my home is a terrible place, I agree, doesn't bother me. Is this not what we also know of Petyr the adult man? No one can bait him and gain any political leverage over him because there's nothing he seems to care about. It's all just an impenetrable wall of quips and jokes and then the indifference of a shrug. When at Riverrun, it is Edmure Tully who comes up with the nickname Littlefinger for him. A nickname meant partly because he grew up at the Fingers, which is a little plot of land. Second, because Petyr is very short in stature and not at all the mighty warrior that a noble man is expected to be. And thirdly, it's a joke about the size of his penis, which when you're a young, insecure man could no doubt be a hell of a blow to your self-esteem. And then it's a nickname that follows him for the rest of his life. Forever called Littlefinger by people with more power and status for him to be able to stop them. He's called Littlefinger far more than he's called Petyr, he just has to accept it as a name. It's perhaps only Catelyn and Lysa who consistently call him by his actual name. Everyone else is keen to mock, and all Petyr can do is try to shrug and act casual like he doesn't care. So again, is that not a model for most of his approach to courts and politics? Well, we clearly need to take this all a step further, but first it's that thing I like to talk about a lot.
Prominent families often forget a simple truth. I found.
And which truth is that?
World Anvil!
His power.
World Anvil! Yep, they sponsored this video, they're still here, hopefully they'll stay here. World Anvil is an online tool for building worlds, creating characters, designing and managing campaigns for a whole slew of games. Sleuth isn't the right word, I don't know why I said that. Look, you can do all that, you can plan and write stories, you can do all sorts of different stuff for creative projects. I use it for the world building of my novel because my old system of massive Word documents became far too chaotic. Not only does the ability to create timelines with hyperlinks branching off to specific characters or articles or a billion other things, not only does that make it so much easier to quickly find the information I need, it also makes it so much easier to plan things out and kind of keep going. Sometimes a blank Word document for world building is very daunting, so having all sorts of tools to help with visualization, to help you figure out what needs planning next, to keep your brain fizzing and unimpeded, because all of the tools are very straightforward and easy to use. That's really important to me. It's like the sharper an artist's pencils, the freer they are to focus on the art. World Anvil is a very sharp pencil. You can create mind maps, you can rearrange elements of your story, do all sorts of campaign related things for that sleuth of games I mentioned. Yes, link in the description and as a pinned comment should you desire a 51% discount on all their subscriptions, or if you're not yet sure, then try out the free version for as long as you like. That's what I did at first, and now look where I am, shouting their name at you through a screen. World Anvil! It's worth pointing out that Petyr is quite clever in the way that a lot of this also becomes his strength. It's partly because he is so beneath the rest of court in his standing and so widely mocked by them that they so consistently underestimate and overlook him when we as the audience can see that he is a political threat. He is just this lesser lord who might have plans, sure, but he's pretty harmless. He has no nobility that can threaten, he seems indifferent to ruthless ambition, and I imagine they think it's quite hard to feel threatened by a man that they address as Little Penis. Out of the great houses, it is only really Tyrion who becomes suspicious of him, and I think that's partly because whilst Tyrion is of the great house Lannister, he is also a dwarf unfavoured by his father and mocked by most, so I think he also sees Petyr a little more like a rival of equal footing than someone beneath him. Tyrion quite literally tells his father that they should be careful to trust Petyr, and the response from Kevan Lannister is, "Littlefinger may be clever, but he has neither high birth nor skill at arms. The lords of the Vale will not accept such as their liege." He looked to his brother. When Lord Tywin nodded, he continued, "And there's this. Lord Petyr continues to demonstrate his loyalty. Only yesterday he brought us word of a Tyrell plot to spirit Sansa Stark off to Highgarden." It seems kind of mad that, from an outside perspective, that the Lannisters would consider Petyr Baelish loyal. Petyr realises he can't beat them at their own game. They're always going to look down on him, but he can exploit that arrogance. And we'll explore how a little bit later, but for now there's 2 points to be made. The first one is, probably should have gone in the last section actually, but it's that Petyr is very motivated by the hope to distance himself from his home. He quite literally invents a new house sigil for himself. Littlefinger, in a way, inadvertently gives him a new name of his own. To a slightly contradictory extent, it means he is seen as his own person. That is contradictory, but either way, he wants to be seen as his own man, who earned what he did from his own merit. A man who has nothing to do with his father, and the fingers, beyond it being like a stick to stab in the ground as a milestone to show how far he's come since then, isn't really something he wants to associate with. His very driven and ambitious quest for power is partly to escape his past as a small boy from a small home who was bullied as someone inferior. And hopefully you notice a contradiction in that too, because he wants to be seen as his own man, and he wants to be powerful. But it is the fact of his lesser lineage and his humble beginnings that he depends on for the power he has gained. Not entirely, obviously, but it is this that causes people to underestimate him. And them underestimating is what's enabled him to climb so high. The thing he's trying to escape, he also kind of depends upon. And he can keep on distancing himself for now, but at some point, maybe that's a conflict. Ideally, it's a contradiction you could find some peace with, to accept that you do have your roots, and that you can use them and make them a strength, but to also not feel chained by them and to want to be someone more and someone different. That could be a great positive thing, but to me, it seems Petyr is caught in a trap of trying to run away from something he's also dragging along behind himself. It suggests something is stopping him from properly moving on. At the moment, a lot of that is conjecture, but I think it might knit together more as this video goes along. For now, it's enough to point out this motive and the contradiction within it. Secondly, it's to talk about everything that happens when he is at River Run. Well, almost everything. Petyr falls in love with Catelyn Tully, who was, I think, about 3 or 4 years older than him. It's also worth noting that Petyr is younger than all of the Tully children. It's easy to imagine a dynamic where he becomes something like a lackey to them. And also, I don't think it's actually love, but it's just easier to refer to as love, okay? Petyr falls in love with someone who, A, does not love him back, and B, doesn't even take it seriously. I don't think that's meant to hurt him, but god damn it would. Catelyn just looks on it like some harmless, innocent kid struggling to understand romantic notions. That is definitely how it starts. That's definitely why Petyr and Catelyn and Lysa play games where they kiss each other and pretend to be knights and maidens from songs. But for Petyr, it grows into something much more that Catelyn just does not recognise. She sees him a little bit like a boy when he wants to be seen as a man. Especially when Edmure is also mocking Petyr for the thing most typically and classically associated with masculinity. Catelyn does not love Petyr, and then her father matches her to Brandon Stark. She is to marry the heir to the mighty house of Winterfell, Wardens of the North. Brandon is a skilled and ferocious fighter with far more nobility than Petyr can even dream of. And this is where Petyr is forced to really learn that he can't beat these High Lords at their own game, because he challenges Brandon to a duel for Catelyn's hand in marriage. Which is such a young, impulsive, reckless, idealised thing to do. When you're so lost in your desires here and want to show the world how daring you are, that Petyr Baelish is not some short man to overlook. He can be a fighter too. Except he's not one. The experience is so painfully humiliating to the extent Catelyn is having to intervene and beg to stop Brandon from killing Petyr, which, A, the fact he feels socially unrestrained from killing Petyr shows how little he is considered here, and B, the woman you're trying to impress is now begging to save your life. It's not quite the look Petyr was going for. And it's a story that also follows him round for the rest of his life. Besides being called Littlefinger, this is the thing he's most known for. And then it gets worse, because Petyr gets the other sister, Lysa Tully, pregnant. And that is a very misleading way for me to explain what happens with Lysa. I'll promise I'll get to it properly in a moment. I'm just being concise here. Lysa becomes pregnant, it is Petyr's child, and Lysa's father, Hoster Tully, finds out. He forces Lysa to drink moon tea and tansy that will cause an abortion. He banishes Petyr, sends him back to the Fingers, that small, lowly place he's been so keen to escape. Suddenly, he's just disposed of, to live in shame and humiliation. And I would speculate Petyr feels like a mere object here, a toy in other people's games, a pawn to be pushed around a chessboard. From his perspective, he is a lesser lord to be bullied, to have Catelyn play with his heart only to then push him away, to be treated like a lackey and then disposed of. And again, we will get to Lysa there in a moment, but basically, let me read this quote from Petyr. In King's Landing there are two sorts of people, the players and the pieces. Every man's a piece to start with, and every maid as well. This is Petyr's whole philosophy about politics and about people. I think that tells us clearly he felt like a piece growing up within other people's games, and so, what is he motivated to do? Reverse the playing board. Make all this world of the Higher Lords, make them the pieces within his own game. Make them feel how he felt. projecting all of that inferiority onto them. He wanted to beat them at their own game, but as his duel with Brandon demonstrates, it's not as simple as that. He has to appear lesser and inferior and harmless, all the while controlling them from behind the scenes like puppets on the string. I am the player. Catelyn wasn't playing with me, I'm the one playing with her. When he meets adult Catelyn again at King's Landing, I imagine there is a level of glee in how Petyr is able to lie and deceive her to his own ends there. I am not a piece to Lysa, I am marrying her, I am taking all her inheritance and then murdering her. I am not a piece to Cersei or Tywin or anyone, I am secretly master of the board. And here is a very important caveat that should extend to pretty much every point I make in this video. It's that we don't know enough about Petyr. Our knowledge is limited. Am I suggesting there is a link between the ways Petyr was treated as a child and how very cold and calculated and manipulative he becomes in adult life? Yes, I think there is a link. However, I do not believe that it's the only factor. It's just we don't know the other factors. That's pretty obvious actually when I say it out loud. I probably didn't need to say that. Anyway, let's unpick this cold and calculating image a little bit more. I pity her then. She wants power, but has no notion what to do with it when she gets it. Petyr says of Cersei, but it raises the question, what does Petyr want? We know he wants power, yes, but why? What else? What will he do with it? Again, our limited knowledge of Petyr impedes us here. The clearest explanation we do get of his plans is when he explains that he's planning to marry Sansa, disguised as Elaine to Harry the Heir, who is set to inherit the Eyrie should Robin Arryn die, and then once the two are married he will reveal Sansa's true identity to the world again. It will unite the Vale with the North, who wish to support the Starks, and then something. Not only does this still leave his motives pretty vague, but there's also the faint sense he might be lying to Sansa here. This might not be his plan at all, actually. So why does Petyr want power? To distance himself and his sense of identity from the home he grew up at? Yes. I think we can see him seeking escape, to feel superior for once instead of inferior, to make others feel that, especially the highborn that caused him so much pain and made his own advancement so very difficult. Yes. I think if we took a moment to explore it, we can also say Petyr wants chaos. His most iconic line from the show is that
Chaos isn't a pit. Chaos is a ladder.
Chaos is a ladder. The more turmoil there is, the more opportunities to exploit it for your own advancement. Petyr doesn't say this in the books, but he does still talk about the importance of confusing your opponent, and I think all of his political schemes are engineered to create chaos. He literally plots to set the great houses of Stark and Lannister at war with each other. In many ways, Petyr is the main architect of the tumultuous war that would be dubbed the War of the Five Kings. And of course you can say, well, he doesn't want chaos itself, that's just his means to gain more power, but I'd say it isn't the only means Petyr could have sought out, and with some loose speculation I'd suggest that it's easy to imagine how satisfying the chaos might feel for him. To be standing in the eye of the storm of his own creation, watching everyone around him reeling and caught in panic and destruction. I think that experience would feel more like power than the actual concrete gains themselves. So all of that is true, in my opinion, but I also want to set out that across the next few sections, some other basic motives that tell us a lot about Petyr Baelish, and this one, for all the times I've used the phrases cold and calculating, I don't think Petyr is anywhere near as coldly rational as he sometimes appears to us. It's just this very interesting moment with Tyrion in the books that I couldn't help thinking about. You see, Tyrion has a clever little trick to figure out which people are divulging secrets to Queen Cersei. Who can Tyrion trust to talk to? Well, he comes up with 3 different plans involving Cersei's children. One where he plans to marry Princess Myrcella off to a prince in Dorne, one where she is to go to the Vale, and one where he plans to send Tommen to Dorne instead. He shares a different one of these plans to Pycelle, to Petyr, and Varys. And then he knows who can't be trusted when Cersei later comes to Tyrion complaining about one of these plans.
But the Queen mustn't know. But remember, the Queen mustn't know. But remember,
You must tell no one.
Tell no one what?
It's a clever trick, but it involves lying to Petyr, pretending he plans on sending Myrcella to the Vale, pretending he needs Petyr to go and broker an agreement for that marriage, pretending he is going to offer Petyr to become Lord of Harrenhal as a reward. The idea of gaining Harrenhal is attractive to Petyr. Littlefinger looks like a boy who had just taken a furtive bite from honeycomb. He was trying to watch for bees, but the honey was so sweet. And then later, when Petyr finds out none of this was ever planned to happen, it was part of a bigger trick, Petyr is really, really angry about it. Lord Petyr, I sense you are unhappy with me. I love you as much as I ever have, my lords, though I do not relish being played for a fool. If Myrcella weds Trystane Martell, she can scarcely wed Robert Arryn, can she? Tyrion tries to apologise, but it doesn't do. Littlefinger was not appeased. I do not like being lied to, my lord. Leave me out of your next deception. If I have given offence, I am deeply sorry. All men know how much we love you, my lord, and how much we need you. Try and remember that. Littlefinger left them. It is so unlike Petyr to be without any quips or japes at all. The man is always keen to keep an amiable or indifferent smile on his lips, and yet here we see him deadly serious, storming off without a single quip. This really, really rankles him, and it's not even that big of a deal. Whilst Petyr has somewhat numbed himself to the constant mockery and being overlooked or seen as inferior or whatever else, his defence is the idea that secretly he's outwitting the lot of them. So when Tyrion, who is from a great house, let's also add, is able to dupe him in such a direct and overt way, even when it's not really an attack on Petyr and changes very little, that's a big wound to his ego. This is the thing he needs to feel best at, otherwise it takes him right back to that earlier, deeper feeling of being the piece instead of the player. And in my opinion, he holds a grudge about this. When we come to the Purple Wedding, it is Petyr's plan to poison King Joffrey and have Tyrion accused for the crime and therefore executed for it. Although there is also some theory to suggest Tyrion was the intended target, but either way the point works. Is this because Tyrion is just the most obvious target to blame? Is it because he needs Tyrion dead for Sansa to become free to marry again? Yes, I think both of those points are true, and I can't really provide much evidence for this, but it's worth throwing out there anyway. I think since Tyrion tricked him, Petyr has been playing the long game, eager for a chance to get his revenge, to destroy Tyrion. And if we took that to be true, I know it's an if, it's then entirely unsurprising that Petyr's great plan to create chaos and advance his own standing in the world involves pitting the Starks against the Lannisters, then betraying Ned Stark and getting him killed. The same Ned Stark who ended up marrying Catelyn after Brandon's death. The Ned Stark who is loved by the woman Petyr so ardently desires. I mean, Petyr is not shy with his mockery when it comes to Ned. The only other person Petyr insults so brazenly and directly to their face is Varys, but Ned is Lord of Winterfell and Hand of the King. When he claims he's leading Ned to meet Catelyn in the city, his jealousy is obvious here. For the last time, come. Or don't come, and I'll keep her for myself. My favourite is in that same chapter. He has to lead Ned down a difficult, rocky descent, and Ned takes a lot longer with it because he doesn't know this way, he's not familiar, and he's older. By the time Ned reaches the bottom, Petyr is lying on the grass, nonchalantly eating an apple, almost down to the core, which is such an obvious, deliberate gesture to show up Ned. You can just picture him reaching the bottom and going, quick, where's an apple? I'll eat this fruit as quickly as I can and lie back looking relaxed, and when I'm near to the core, I'll slow down, and when he gets here, I'll make it look like he's taken forever. And on top of that, when Ned does reach him, he even takes a shot at how old and slow Ned is getting, as if his whole gesture didn't make it obvious. Like, it's not hugely rude, it's just so unnecessary and petty. There are other convoluted and long-term plots Petyr might have drawn up in order to create chaos and advance his station. The fact he comes up with one that involves destroying Ned, I think tells us it's not always coldly rational with him. That maybe he's also seeking very personal moments of revenge. And if you say, well no, he doesn't want to portray Ned in the books. He gives Ned honest advice on what he should do, and he's only forced to portray Ned when Ned doesn't agree to the advice. You could say that, but I've already said it for you now, and to that I'd say let's look at how Petyr words his advice. Another long extract, I'm afraid. Hear me out. Stannis is no friend of yours, nor of mine. Even his brothers can scarcely stomach him. The man is iron, hard and unyielding. He'll give us a new hand and a new council for a certainty. No doubt he'll thank you for handing him the crown, but he won't love you for it. And his assent will mean war. Stannis cannot rest easy on the throne until Cersei and her bastards are dead. Do you think Lord Tywin will sit idly while his daughter's head is measured up for a spike? Casterly Rock will rise. And not alone. Robert found it in him to pardon men who served King Aerys, so long as they did him fealty. Stannis is less forgiving. He will not have forgotten the siege of Storm's End, and the Lords Tyrell and Redwyne dare not. Every man who fought beneath the Dragon Banner or rose with Balon Greyjoy will have good cause to fear. Seat Stannis on the Iron Throne, and I promise you, the realm will bleed. Now look at the other side of the coin. Joffrey is but 12, and Robert gave you the regency, my lord. You are Hand of the King and Protector of the Realm. The power is yours, Lord Stark. All you need to do is reach out and take it. Make your peace with the Lannisters. Release the imp. Wed Joffrey to your Sansa. Wed your younger girl to Prince Tommen and your heir to Myrcella. It will be 4 years before Joffrey comes of age. By then, he will look to you as a second father. And if not, well, 4 years is a long while, my lord. Enough to dispose of Lord Stannis. Then should Joffrey prove troublesome, we can reveal his little secret and put Lord Renly on the throne. We, Ned repeated. Littlefinger gave a shrug. You'll need someone to share your burdens. I assure you, my price would be modest. Your price? Ned's voice was ice. Lord Baelish, what you suggest is treason. Petyr Baelish is very accomplished with persuasion, and yet he words everything in the exact way that would fail to persuade Ned here. He talks of Ned reaching out and taking power, knowing full well that is something he is uncomfortable with and that Ned doesn't want it. He talks of making peace with the Lannisters, who Ned believed tried to kill his son, and he offers no argument to soften or counteract that. He talks of murdering Stannis and manipulating a child, and concludes all of it with a talk of prices. Petyr knows full well all of this will disgust Ned, and then when Ned responds that it would be treason, Petyr immediately gives up trying to persuade him. No great effort made. He just wants to be able to say, I tried persuading your husband Catelyn, or I tried persuading your father Sansa, but he wouldn't listen to reason, he got himself killed. So, yes, generally that's one other possible motive, revenge against those who he perceived to have hurt him. Which, if that's true, of course raises the question, who else might have hurt Petyr? Who else might he want revenge against? I'll leave that hanging, and discuss another motive now. Another way I think Petyr is misunderstood is when he's described as a cautious man. He certainly talks about the need to keep his hands clean when making moves, and he does have the spine of a well-considered, very long-term plan. However, it also is always just the spine, because he understands that even the humblest of pieces can have wills of their own. Sometimes they refuse to make the moves you've planned for them. He keeps himself free to adapt. He is a great improviser, and I think backing himself to be able to improvise with situations that he can't predict shows he is not quite as cautious as he may seem, particularly when so many of his improvised moves can be so very bold and risky. One example of course being the dagger. Catelyn comes to King's Landing with a Valyrian dagger that has a dragonbone hilt that an assassin attempted to murder her son with. Petyr doesn't know why she's come to King's Landing, he doesn't know about the assassination attempt or the dagger or any of it until Catelyn is right in front of him explaining the situation assassination and asking him whose dagger it is. Right then and there on the spot, he invents the lie that this was his dagger until he lost it in a bet to Tyrion Lannister. Therefore, it is Tyrion's dagger. He is behind the assassination attempt. I would have told you that there was only one knife like this at King's Landing. He grasped the blade between thumb and forefinger, drew it back over his shoulder, and threw it across the room with a practiced flick of the wrist. It struck the door and buried itself deep in the oak, quivering. It's mine. What better way to appear familiar with a knife than flicking it about in your hands and throwing it skillfully? Not only is this a brilliant piece of improvisation that works out perfectly for him in the long term, but it's incredibly risky, because it depends on the fact of this so-called bet. Petyr explains that during the joust for Joffrey's name day, Petyr bet on Jaime where Tyrion bets on Sir Loras. Sir Loras won, therefore Tyrion won the dagger. However, everybody at court knows that Tyrion always bets on his family, would have bet on Jaime. All Catelyn would have had to do is check what Petyr told her with anyone and she would have discovered that he was lying. In fact, she very nearly does discover when Tyrion is later her captive and tells her outright that he always bets on Jaime. Tyrion's problem here is twofold. One being that his earlier reasoning that almost convinced Catelyn to see the truth had Catelyn responding as such. Just for a moment, he thought he saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes, but what she said was, "Why would Petyr lie to me?" Catelyn remembers Petyr as a close friend when she was young. She doesn't want to think he'd trick her, and secondly, Tyrion's attempts to convince Catelyn leads him further and further down a route of insulting her, making her then less inclined to believe him and more inclined to trust Petyr. I promise you that it is not your hand that he boasts of. It's those ripe breasts of yours, and that sweet mouth, and the heat between your legs. You know, of course she stops listening to him at this. Ned also comes close to noticing this lie when he is watching the jousting at his tourney, and Petyr this time does bet on Jaime and then loses to Renly, who declares, "A pity the imp is not here with us," Lord Renly said. "I should have won twice as much." Because, again, Tyrion always bets on Jaime. Lord Renly says this right next to Ned after Petyr himself initiated this bet in front of Ned. All it would take is for him to question it. I can certainly imagine Petyr finding great pleasure there in dangling the truth over Ned's head and watching him fail to notice. Petyr takes a lot of risks. He is a gambler. It's how he makes all of his wealth, and he is an aggressive one at that. For me, a big part of all of this for Petyr is the sheer thrill of the risk. He failed to show the kind of aggressive prowess and bravery he sought for when fighting Brandon, but he can do something similar here, and it's absolutely intoxicating. All these aggressive risks and plays, it is no wonder he describes it as the game. But I will just add before we move on, because it's worth highlighting this other aggressive move. Petyr has been stealing funds from the crown treasury for years in order to amass his own wealth. King Aerys left a crown overflowing with gold, and then suddenly we're meant to believe that the crown is now 6 million gold pieces in debt, simply due to Robert's exorbitant love of feasts and tourneys. It's a hell of a risk when you're master of coin to steal so much gold and trust that you can blame all of the failing finances on the king's personal spending. It's a considered lie, admittedly. Petyr understands investments at a time when so many of the highborn had little interest in the details of their accounts. You know, they're too used to having gold to look closely at it. Along comes Petyr, who doesn't just shut gold in vaults, he invests it in different trades and products, buys low and sells high, and quickly distinguishes himself in Goldtown by making a lot of money for Jon Arryn. I would presume Petyr steals nothing in the beginning, seeking instead to build his reputation as a wizard with gold, as someone who can make coins appear out of thin air. And it's only once this illusion is firmly embedded that he starts stealing gold, when it also works alongside the known fact and semi-myth that Robert spends too much. That's quite clever. We know, I think, even in modern day scams, how easily myth and illusion is all it takes to stop people questioning the obvious. Tyrion starts to question it when he takes over as Master of Coin. He does get very close to the truth. The more Tyrion tried to make sense of his accounts, the more his head hurt. It was all very well to talk of breeding dragons instead of locking them up in the treasury, but some of these ventures smelled worse than weak old fish. Funny how Tyrion ends up arrested as part of a plot by Petyr before he can get to the bottom of the accounts. But okay, let's get to the real stuff now, shall we? This section might be an uncomfortable one, but we've got to discuss Lysa. I think it's easy to empathise with the idea of 15-year-old Petyr desperately dueling Brandon for Catelyn's hand in marriage. It's stupid and reckless and mad, but when you think of all of the stupid things 15-year-old kids do when they're drunk on ideas of love, I can't help but feel for him. The question is, of course, why doesn't Petyr move on from this? Catelyn describes it as childish, innocent teenage ideas of romance, which is partly her misunderstanding him, yes, but it's also partly true. Why doesn't Petyr grow and move on from Cat? Especially when he's not seen her for years. One problem here is that the story of this duel follows Petyr everywhere. You know, it's really hard to move on from a humiliating experience when nobody ever lets you live it down. And we absolutely should not downplay how humiliated Petyr feels in general, but there's also something more here. We need to talk about S.A. The more it appears in the backstories for a lot of characters in these books, the more I start to think it's the main theme, exploring the effects trauma, and particularly S.A. can have on people. When Catelyn's betrothal to Brandon Stark was announced, Petyr drank heavily at the feast. When he then drunkenly tried to kiss Catelyn, she pushed him away and laughed. This is all according to Lysa, but we can assume it's largely true. And he then continued drinking heavily after this until passing out at the table and being carried to bed by Brynden Tully, who, I should mention, Brynden is actually suggested to be quite a positive father figure in Petyr's life. We speculated loosely about Petyr having a distant or cold father, but Brynden is definitely there for him, just later at an age where his development is becoming a bit more set. Either way, once in bed, Lysa came to his chambers and had sex with him. Petyr was too drunk to consent or to properly understand. Petyr thought she was Cat, called her Cat, and said that he loved her before completely passing out. Lysa frantically admits all of this to Sansa at the end of A Storm of Swords.
That was the night I stole up to his bed to give him comfort. I bled, but it was the sweetest hurt. He told me he loved me then, but he called me Cat, just before he fell back to sleep. Even so, I stayed with him until the sky began to lighten. Your mother did not deserve him.
I read that quote because I know some people argue that afterwards Petyr didn't realise this was Lysa. Petyr does certainly talk in the books about taking Catelyn's virginity, however I think it's unlikely for several reasons that he wouldn't later realise this was Lysa, especially when that quote makes clear she stayed beside him until the morning. It's my firm belief this was a damaging experience for Petyr. It is S.A. He is also still either 14 or 15 at this point. Here are some things we know about the adult Petyr Baelish. He is still massively infatuated with Catelyn, this wishful, childish idea of romance that has gotten kinda stuck in his head, unable to move on or see past it. In the context of trauma, that is worth noting. We also know how very regularly he talks and boasts about taking Catelyn's virginity when he in fact never did. That was Lysa, who he drunkenly mistook for Cat in the moment. Even if it was Cat, that doesn't mean it would have been consenting, by the way, but he thought it was Cat. He would have realised afterwards, however, carried on eager to try and interpret it that way. That he took Catelyn's virginity. He in fact brags about taking both sisters' virginity. Why, every man at court has heard him tell how he took your maidenhead, my lady. I've heard it say that you grew quite close to the Tullys.
You might say so. The girls especially.
How close?
I took their maidenheads. Is that close enough?
I believe Lord Petyr may hold the key to the Eyrie.
Oh, I do,
said Littlefinger.
I have it here, between my legs. Family, duty, honour meant that I could not have her hand, but she gave me something finer. A gift a woman can give but once.
Partly this lie no doubt softens the humiliation of his duel with Brandon, to kind of say, well, I didn't get to marry her, but I took her virginity. Although, keep in mind how very 15-year-old all that thinking sounds. But to tell this boast so often and with such bragging, even when I think he's about 29 or 30 now, to still be bragging about this, it strikes me as more than easing an insecurity about his duel with Brandon. Perhaps instead this is something he is very eager to convince himself of. Already humiliated in a lot of other ways, already feeling used like a piece to be toyed with and then disposed of, Petyr instead wants to feel like a man in a society that places so much emphasis on masculinity and being a mighty warrior with all these knightly ideals of winning a maiden's hand. It would seem, rather than interpreting himself as a victim here, he tries to reframe it as a conquest. I actively seduced her, and it was Catelyn. I can't deny Lysa because she was made to drink moon tea, and Hostatully and a few others found out about that, but it was also Catelyn. Something else we know about Petyr. He talks a lot in general about sex. The show doesn't convey this at all well, because, everyone in the show is constantly talking about sex. Often I think just for the appeal of the vulgarity, but it means you don't notice how kind of ridiculous a lot of this is. Petyr talks about sex in a way that strikes me as exactly how young teenage boys talk. Almost as though there's a little part of Petyr that still feels 15 years old. There's obviously all those quotes in relation to Catelyn and Lysa, but here's a couple of other ones.
Lead Lord Varys to me, sweet lady. If you will permit me a small obscenity, and where better for it than here, I hold the man's balls in the palm of my hand.
He cupped his fingers, smiling.
Or would, if he were a man, or had any balls. They say the hand dreams the king's dreams, speaks with the king's voice, and rules with the king's sword. Does that mean you also fuck with the king's...
Lord Baelish, Ned interrupted. The most interesting pattern is this string of comments he makes about having sex with women he considers undesirable.
You'd have to be a fool to bed Selyse Florent,
said Littlefinger. He makes that comment twice, but more notably,
when you find yourself in bed with an ugly woman, the best thing to do is close your eyes and get on with it,
he declared.
Waiting won't make the maid any prettier. Kiss her and be done with it.
In fact, he repeats this one to Tyrion when talking specifically about the idea of bedding Lysa Tully.
You realise that I may need to bed Lysa Arryn again to get her consent to this marriage? I have little doubt you'll be equal to the task. I once told Ned Stark that when you find yourself naked with an ugly woman, the only thing to do is close your eyes and get on with it.
I think that expresses quite a lot about his feelings. We could also even note that the analogy doesn't actually work. If you find yourself in bed with a woman you don't want to have sex with, don't close your eyes. Say no. If you didn't know the context of his experience with Lysa, it would seem like an incredibly odd analogy to use. It's hard when we don't have point of view chapters from Petyr's perspective, but I would speculate that what we're seeing here is trauma. We have a man where one part of him is stuck in the trauma of the past, trying to escape the pain of feeling like a victim by framing himself as some young, adolescent-minded figure of conquest, but then he never quite heals or moves forwards. I don't think we can be exactly certain how this ties to Catelyn, but he's certainly chained to the romantic feelings he had at the time. And arguably Catelyn becomes an idealised object that he hopes would resolve the trauma. Winning her love would mean he wasn't a victim. Perhaps would make this framing of conquest more believable. Catelyn was what he wanted at the time. His teenage brain hoped she was the answer to all of his problems, so when he's struggling with this extra hurricane of emotion that he doesn't even know how to make sense of, perhaps Catelyn would stay as the answer, the image in his head of how things could have been. Perhaps, like Catelyn, he too might have moved on and come to see this duel with Brandon as humiliating and awful, but also just the feelings of a younger, more innocent boy. Instead he's kinda gotten stuck. But also maybe there's the reverse here. He might be hoping Catelyn's the answer, the thing that will magically heal him, but what about Lysa? What about revenge? Petyr, as an adult, marries Lysa Tully in order to advance his nobility and power. I think his main motives are political power. I also don't think having sex with her again is the healthiest thing to do from a trauma perspective, but I wouldn't be surprised if there is, within that action, a small part of him hoping it might help him process what happened. To kind of flip it, for him to be the active one, he's choosing to do it this time. He's the one who's got the power because he's manipulating her this time as well. And then he kills her with such sinister relish in the way he throws Lysa to her death. "My sweet, silly, jealous wife," he said, chuckling. "I've only loved one woman, I promise you." Lysa Arryn smiled tremulously. "Only one? Oh, Petyr, do you swear it's only one?" "Only cat." He gave her a short, sharp shove. Does this feel good for Petyr? His reaction suggests so. Does it help him heal in the ways he might hope it would? Probably not. We're going to discuss Sansa in a second, but first a quick word on the fact Petyr comes to King's Landing and buys up pretty much all the brothels in the city. And there are a lot of political and financial reasons that make this a smart move. We also don't actually know too much about how he runs them or what his feelings are, and generally I'm uncomfortable to speculate too much when it comes to SA. It just feels a bit wrong to do that somehow, so I'm not going to try and make any connections here. However, we should mention Jeyne Poole. Jeyne is Sansa's best friend. However, after Ned Stark is arrested and most of his guard killed, Queen Cersei wants Jeyne gone so that Sansa's isolated and therefore easier to manipulate. Petyr takes Jeyne Poole away, and we don't hear anything about her until A Dance with Dragons, when suddenly she is disguised as Sansa's missing sister Arya Stark. And she is married to Ramsay Bolton so that the Boltons can pretend they've married a Stark and therefore have a claim to Winterfell. Jeyne makes an awful comment that hints at what Petyr has put her through, and I'll be honest, I won't read it because I think the implications it leaves are some of the most disturbing things from any of the books. But the line ends with a frightened Jeyne saying, "I'm a good girl, they trained me." It's just awful. Let us not forget in all this talk about Petyr's feelings that so much of his behaviour is horrendous. Who knows how many people there are that Petyr has put through similar experiences that we'll never hear about because they're common folk and just not treated as important in Westeros society. That, of course, is another huge theme in the books. And to be honest, this might be me having a blind spot because of how awful it is, but I cannot see why Petyr does this. Jeyne is Sansa's best friend. Sansa who Petyr is hoping will develop feelings for him. Sansa who wants to go back to Winterfell and has a claim to it. Petyr sends her best friend to Winterfell, who can easily be tied right back to him, especially when Sansa herself saw Petyr take Jeyne away, and when surely at some point word is going to spread about an Arya Stark at Winterfell who isn't actually Arya but someone who was a friend of the Starks. It's a move that seems destined to backfire on Petyr and provides so little gain in the first place. Is this worth it? In which case, is there something I'm not seeing? It makes me feel like there has to be more unconscious, emotionally driven reasons to do this to Sansa's best friend, but that doesn't feel entirely clear to me either. And this is where people start speculating, is Petyr a psychopath, ASPD, narcissism? He certainly does share a lot of traits, but I'm not entirely convinced it's enough. And those of you who have watched a lot of my other character analysis videos know I'm uneasy about diagnosing people. Don't get me wrong, there is a good educational benefit to doing that with fictional people where it doesn't technically matter, but I feel like our culture is already becoming far too keen to diagnose people on the flimsiest of evidence. I'm just personally more concerned with encouraging empathy rather than labels in these videos, but you're obviously free to debate in the comments. Catelyn dies in a storm of swords though, or sort of. If Petyr still hoped to win her love, that hope is gone. Let's talk about Catelyn's daughter, Sansa. Generally, when I look at the relationship between Petyr and Sansa, I see it as one of a man attempting to groom a child. Fortunately, that isn't entirely happening in the story. Sansa isn't as vulnerable as he might have expected, and she has so far found ways to mostly maintain boundaries with the man she's forced to partly depend upon. I do remain very worried for Sansa, but I'm mostly optimistic for her story in the next book. What's interesting about this depiction of grooming is that it isn't a straight up sinister, this is what he wants, this is how he's manipulating her kind of depiction you often get. Because we've instead got quite a confused and I suppose nuanced depiction in the sense Petyr doesn't really know what he wants. George Martin himself explains this pretty well in a quote I typed out from an interview ages ago. If I can find it again, I'll play the actual clip and link the video below, but if not, I'll read it.
They're partially paternal, because Littlefinger has very mixed feelings here too. I mean, sometimes he sees Sansa and she's the daughter he never had, the daughter that he might have had with Cat if he and Cat had been married as he dreamed when he was a small boy living in her father's castle, and was so madly in love with her. But at other times, he detaches himself from that, and he's less Petyr and he's more Littlefinger, and she's just another piece in the Game of Thrones. She's just another valuable piece that he's going to use to get what he wants. And at yet other times, she's not Cat's daughter. She's like young Cat. She's his teenage fantasies returned again, and then his feelings toward her are sexual and romantic. And those feelings overcome him at the moment when he sees Sansa in the snow, so beautiful in the snow, building the snow castle, Winterfell. It reminds him very much of the young Cat, and he reacts to that by kissing her.
In many ways, that quote says everything we need to say. If this video is about Petyr and his perspective, then he is incredibly confused. Part of him sees Sansa as this child who needs protecting, but the problem is it's all warped by all of these other feelings to do with Catelyn and to do with his trauma that he's still struggling with, and all of it means he's not seeing Sansa as Sansa. Not as a human, but this object for all sorts of his own internal desires. He can act caring in moments, sure. I don't think a lot of his advice is positive, but he definitely does teach her important things, give her a lot of confidence in her own political ability, trust her to come up with solutions to a lot of things. Yeah, those parts do feel good for Sansa. They do have some moments of genuine connection, but is it true care and empathy when it's not really Sansa he's seeing? Ideally, I think Petyr would see Sansa like a daughter, not as this imagined vision of she is the daughter I would have had with Catelyn, she is going to fill my desires there, but that she is just a vulnerable person who needs support and guidance. I want to help her as though I were a father figure. And I think were that the case, this experience of mentoring Sansa might have been a positive one for him. Might have helped him come to terms with his grief over Catelyn, might have enabled him to see how that young, vulnerable innocence is something that deserves care and protection, as the young Petyr deserved care himself. Looking after Sansa, especially with everything she's been through, could have been a small experience of looking after his own inner child. Maybe that's all pretty loose for me to say, but of course that's not what this experience is. That's just not the way Petyr perceives and engages with other people. He's stuck repeating over old feelings rather than processing them, and it does make you really worry for Sansa. There are a lot of moments in these chapters where just the way he's described as looking at her, or a turn of phrase, or the way he gradually builds up physical contact with her, all whilst trying to frame it as some sort of game, playing at being father and daughter. It's just really uncomfortable. And I think George did a brilliant job of writing that from Sansa's perspective. It's the one thing I wish I talked about more in my Sansa video. Although that video is 2 hours long, and I did discuss it, but it's just that video could have been twice as long and I could have discussed this a lot more. One thing I do want to at least point out is that The moment where Petyr kisses her, that George there describes in that interview as being overcome with his teenage fantasies, it's a moment where Sansa challenges him and tells Petyr off as though he were some mischievous child. She throws snow at him. Petyr yelped as the snow slid down under his collar. "That was unchivalrously done, my lady. As was bringing me here, when you swore to take me home." She wondered where this courage had come from, to speak to him so frankly. Now maybe being challenged like that does make him feel a teenager again. It's certainly a dynamic he seems to have had with Catelyn, who was older than him as a child. Catelyn vividly remembers the look of contrition he would pull. He looked contrite. The look brought back vivid memories for Catelyn. He had always been a sly child, but after his mischief he had always looked contrite. It was a gift he had. There's just an uncomfortable and interesting irony there. For all Petyr's hopes to control and manipulate Sansa, it's in the moment where she challenges him that he suddenly wants to kiss her. But look, I asked the question, what does Petyr want, and I raised various motives he might have had for his ruthless pursuits of more and more power. He might even have some image in his head of what the end goal looks like, not that we've seen that, but is that all really vision? Direction? Catelyn once remarked that Petyr was exceedingly clever but never at all wise. All of these elaborate, genuinely brilliant schemes to achieve what? Leave him trapped running circles with his trauma, projecting onto others, and then trying to seek salvation in a girl who will almost certainly never love him and is a vulnerable girl. It's kind of tragic when you look at it like that. He's destroying so many lives along the way. What is all of it really for? Petyr Baelish fascinates me because I think in a nutshell, all too often we see people who seek power as an answer to pain. Only they never quite learn that it doesn't heal them. They just get lost in the endless, often thrilling pursuit, caught in some sort of a cycle. In a lot of ways, Petyr could have been a character to root for. Someone, okay, not common-born, but pretty low down the ladder, who might seek to dismantle the very feudalistic culture and change the society of Westeros, but he doesn't. Even on a smaller scale, there's not even anyone beyond maybe Sansa that he's building anything for. Tywin at least has his brother Kevan to work with and his Lannister line. Varys has Illyrio and possibly young Griff. Petyr is alone, has no true friends, inspires no loyalty, and arguably beyond feeding his impulses and reacting to his trauma, has no plan of anything to build. Just chaos. He's lost within the Game of Thrones because the game itself is all he has. And yeah, I find that kind of tragic. But that's where this video ends. I can't believe it turned out this long. It really wasn't meant to be. I was intending to make a shorter one because I only just got another PC that I really don't have the finances for. I wanted something out quick. Also, by the way, the 55-minute Spirited Away video I had almost finished editing before my last PC broke. I haven't been able to recover that project, so I'll have to edit the whole thing again for a second time. It was over a year ago when I recorded that video, but every time I try to edit it, my computer seems to die. I thought I'd learnt the first time. I backed up all of the files I use from DaVinci Resolve editing, but it turns out it backed up all of them but the actual project file itself, so none of the rest of them do anything. So yeah, I've tried to rush to get this video done in a week. I don't know if I've managed to succeed in that, we'll see. Please share your comments, everything I've missed or gotten wrong, or sometimes just worded badly. That happens more than you'd think. Like the video if you liked it, subscribe, maybe support me on Patreon, or I've set up a Buy Me a Coffee page if you wanted to offer extra support. Otherwise though, hopefully see you next time. And as ever, a special thank you goes to Flying Spider, Grace, Kellyanne Davidson, Luke Orr, Michael Gallagher, Chad Bramwell and Joshua C. Follier. Thank you.